Right, good evening everyone and welcome to this Sustainable Sheep Systems webinar as part of the Farm Advisory Service. Tonight's webinar on Footrot and Flystrike resistance. Tonight's webinar run for about an hour till about 8:30, but if there's plenty of questions coming in, we might just go a few minutes longer. We'll run for about an hour and we're delighted to be joined by Mark Ferguson, founder and CEO of neXtgen Agri International. Where Mark is joining us from Australia, where it is 6:30 in the morning. We're really delighted to have him, and I'm sure there'll be a few regular listeners to the Head Shepherd podcast that'll be excited to see him on a webinar over here. Just a little bit of a bio about Mark before we pass over. Mark has a degree at University of Melbourne. He then went on to the research doctorate at Murdoch University, studying merino genetics and intermediate metabolism. He then went on to be a sheep production research scientist for 10 years, which included the Lifetime Wool Project, looking at the impact of maternal nutrition on lifetime performance of progeny merinos, which did have a major impact on farmers' attitudes over there to nutritional management. He then looked at maximizing maternal efficiency through breeding and nutrition strategies with balanced breeding approaches. This included the role of muscle and fat, which was influential in the merino breeding strategies for a more balanced animal. He also spent 2 years lecturing at Murdoch University to veterinary and animal science students and research on biological implications for selection for increases in productivity. He then went on to be a production science manager over at the New Zealand Merino Company, and this is where tonight's topic came in, where he's looked at a series of projects looking at the genetic resistance to Footrot and Flystrike in the merino breed, as well as sheep sensors to monitor welfare. Since 2017, he's gone on to be the co-founder of neXtgen Agri, where they say they are committed to enabling the extensive animal industries to make optimum rates of genetic gain by making timely and well-informed decisions, where they work with stud breeders, offering strategic advice on breeding programs, ongoing review of flock structures, data collection, and assistance with sire and replacement female selection. So something we maybe don't have over here to that extent. I think it's quite an exciting job role for a few of us. They also work with commercial producers where they help utilize data capture analysis to make better informed decisions looking at breeding and feeding, as well as industry bodies managing projects or part of projects. As always, if you want to catch up on the previous webinars to the series, as well as the project overall, you can go to the FAS YouTube channel, where the series this winter has looked at Yonis with Craig Watkins, lameness with Laura Green, blowfly strike with Professor Richard Wall, and low labour input genetics with Tim White of Ixlana. So we can see we've had a good theme going on here. We've looked at the veterinary aspect and developed that further, looking at preventative measures through breeding strategies for these traits and also lower input genetics. Again, as always, if you've got questions, please do put them in the Q&A tab. But if you've got a more direct question to one of us to help with tech, please put that in the chat. But if you could put all your questions in the Q&A, that would be great, and we'll have a bit of discussion later on. And as always, please do fill in your feedback form at the end. It really does help us improve, identify opportunities, and advise us feedback to Scottish Government if we're doing a good job. So without further ado, I will pass you over to Mark Ferguson.
Yep, so we'll just get right into it because Daniel's done all the introduction. But yeah, Footrot and flies is obviously what we're here to talk about tonight, and particularly genetics. I guess as a start, this is pretty much my philosophy. If you can dream it, you can breed it. Pretty much everything on a sheep is heritable. If we wanted to increase their eyelash length, I'm sure we could. And if you only have to look around your part of the world to see the variation that humans have been able to achieve in terms of genetic variation in Ovis areas or sheep. And I guess fundamental to what I do is while it's, I guess, we think about genetics in the terms of chasing production traits, high growth, more lambs, whatever. To me, the power of genetics is just as strong, if not stronger, to improve animal health and welfare as it is to improve production. And so, yeah, all of our clients across Australia and New Zealand, we work pretty hard trying to improve animal welfare or health traits as much as as production, which is what brings us really to tonight. And then just to get us fired up, I think we've probably sat around on our hands for way too long, and just accepted some of the ailments that sheep might have, and sort of blame the sheep for what's wrong with them, rather than to think about how we would fix them or how we would change their genetics to make them easier to farm. And yeah, and so if not now, then when, and if not us, then who? So I think, and that's the way we approach it. We're very, I guess, yeah, it sort of, it's a bit frustrating to think what we could have been doing for the last 40 or 50 years, particularly in this country, and how much further down the line we would be for things like footrot resistance and flystrike resistance if we had have, rather than wait for the next chemical to turn up or the next animal health treatment to turn up, to actually think about what we can do at the DNA level. In terms of Footrot, it's pretty much embedded in New Zealand. It's part of life, to the point where there's been a cartoon, a set of cartoons made about, called Footrot Flats, and so I guess pretty much if people think about sheep in New Zealand, particularly farm sheep in New Zealand, they think about Footrot. So we're going to start there, and then we'll move on to Flystrike at the end, and go through the sort of, I guess, the process that we've been through, and maybe the opportunity that sits there. And yeah, I've sort of got a variety of projects, but 4 feet closer to the perfect sheep is where we'll start. I don't need to tell you anything else. The last talk you had was around Footrot, but it's a massive time killer in the wetter areas of New Zealand and Australia, as it would be in Scotland. And I put that image up mainly because there's one bloke and 3 ladies doing the work on. This is our project when we started. This when I first moved to New Zealand, was made the mistake of buying some sheep unsighted and managed to import 1,000 ewes with Footrot, so that kept us out of trouble for a little while. But obviously we know, you've had webinars and you know this yourself, Footrot is a function of the bacteria being present, the right environmental condition, and the right host. And in where we farm, there's a variety of genetic variation in the host. We've a lot of fine wool production, merino production, and yeah, and obviously there's a big difference in susceptibility of that host, which is what we're going to talk about. Sorry, wrong way. Yeah, again, massive. And I think in terms of the way I look at Footrot, I don't think there's every government department in every state in Australia has spent millions, probably billions if you added it up, trying to eradicate Footrot. The reality is it hasn't gone anywhere, and every time you think you've eradicated it, it's just because it hasn't rained for a while. And so really it's still best practice here is tip them over, trim the feet, put them through zinc sulfate, and stand them in that for 20 minutes, back out, and just that process. And that hasn't changed for 50 years in terms of our options in terms of treatment. There's things like our long-acting, like our mycotills, our long-acting antibiotics and stuff that we've used, and some of the monovalent vaccines that have been used, but really none of those have eradicated Footrot from some properties have been successful, which is a lot of expense and a bit of luck. But essentially the world hasn't changed, so we need to change the sheep. So what we've gone about is setting up a breeding value for Footrot, and so we've inspected, I don't know how many feet, hundreds of thousands of feet now over the last. So I moved to New Zealand in to end of 2012, early 2013, and started this work. And essentially, what we do is we wait until there's a Footrot challenge on, so 50% of the sheep have some level of infection between the toes, score 2, which is where you get reddening and some infection, but not underrunning. And once the mob is at that level and we've got a bit of underrunning in that mob, then we go in and we score. And so these are ram breeding flocks we're talking about. And so we'll go in and score those individual feet. So every foot on every sheep gets a score from 0 to 5. 0 being perfect, 1 being a bit of water maceration but no infection, 2 what we call ovine interdigital dermatitis, or scald we also call it. 3 is a bit of underrunning, 4 is underrunning right across the heel, and 5 being where it's run around to the toe, and what we probably commonly would call Footrot. From my reading, the severity, I don't know, we seem to have an angrier version of Diclobacter nodosus in than you may have, or maybe it's just control measures. But if we get a good challenge, we'll have lots of score 4 feet, and that's obviously a very lame sheep. So what we know is we did a whole heap of work, but one of the things was do a genome-wide association study, which looks at which chromosome is contributing, or which part of it, which chromosome is contributing to genetic variation in Footrot. And what it showed is that all chromosomes are contributing to, or most of them anyway, of the 26 non-sexed chromosomes. There's variation being accounted for across all those. So what that tells us is it's a polygenic trait. So you're not going to fix it by a gene test or a silver bullet. You're going to have to select for it in a quantitative way. So it's like growth or reproduction, or any of the traits that we would typically select for in our ram breeding or our sheep breeding. It's the same in the sense that there's lots of genes that contribute, and we don't really know which one's which. We just know that they're there. And so that was important early on, because I guess there's always the hope that there's a big major gene and you can use genomics to select for it, and then you can screen animals really easily under that case, and then it's a really simple process. But the reality is that's not the way Footrot wants to play. And there's lots of, and you can imagine if what makes a good foot. Is it skin thickness? Is it immune system? Is it how the gap between the claws? Is it how tight the heel is? There's lots of things that you can imagine would contribute to a sheep's susceptibility to foot rot. So it makes sense that there's lots of genes at play. We did find a couple of super SNPs, or so little bits of DNA that did contribute more than average, and so that sort of gets a little bit exciting for a minute. But then we worked out that was only 2% of genetic variation that was accounted for by those single parts of the DNA. So really, you could develop a gene test for those 2 bits, but leaves 98% floating. So that's not that useful. But it's good to know that you're dealing with a trait that's got lots of genes at play, because it changes how you would focus on it. What we now know is that it's about 25% heritable. That obviously heritability variations between breeds and stuff, but so of the proportion of the variation you would see in a flock of sheep that's been exposed to the bacteria, 25% of that is due to their genetic potential, or genetics for resistance to foot rot. So that's pretty cool. That means that you can make good genetic gain. If that number was 2%, like it is for things like lamb survival, it means you can make genetic gain, but it's going to take a while. Whereas this trait is quite heritable. It's quite repeatable, and we've now, I guess, 11 years on, we've seen that some sires will just breed sheep that are good. Breed progeny that are good regardless of where you throw them, and we now know that we can treat this trait like we have lots of other traits, which is pretty exciting space. The other cool thing is that it's not correlated with much. So there's a little correlation with worm resistance in a favorable way. So the sheep that are more resistant to worms tend to be more resistant to foot rot. But if this had been a big, strong correlation against growth or something, or in our case, fleece weight or repro or whatever trait was important to your breeding objective, that makes it harder to make genetic gain, because you know that every sheep you get that's good for foot rot will be terrible for growth, and you have to find the outliers, which we've been good at as an industry. We've broken those genetic correlations over time, various ones, but it just makes it slower and harder. So we are in a good spot in terms of where foot rot sits genetically, and I guess we've sort of, as we'll go through, we've seen how that's played out. Lots of information on this graph, but it's really just to prompt me to talk about it. But so along the horizontal scale there is the variation in the foot rot breeding value. So now we've got this breeding value that's rolled out maybe 7 or 8 years ago. So it takes all of those scores from our scoring. It goes into a genetic evaluation system, the same as operates in all industries have a BLUP or a version of BLUP. Um, and yeah, basically it turns it into this single digit number. And it goes from -1 through to +1. So a -1 is a very resistant animal, and a +1 is a very susceptible animal. And most of our industry sits sort of like you can see the normal distribution here. So most of them sort of sitting between -0.5 and +0.5. And what we've seen, so this was done originally, and we're rapidly shifting that histogram to the left. So it's getting, and that's what genetics is about. You just shift, you don't fix any individual animal, you're shifting the population to a better place. And so we're seeing a lot less +0.5s and +0.4s and a lot more sort of -0.6s and -0.7s. And what that sort of means, if you're out here at -1, you've got, and this is your progeny, or your ram with at -1, the progeny, you'll have no progeny that go to score 4. You'll have a small percentage of animals that get animals that score 3, and then still have some score 2s, but none. Yeah, so you're really reducing how many animals are severely affected by foot rot. If we go out the other end of the scale, it's sort of maybe +0.5 or whatever. You got a third of those animals are severely affected with underrunning. 2/3 have got at least some underrunning, and sort of over 80% of the flock has some impact of foot rot on them. So you can kind of see the impact that we're likely to have by selecting animals that are more resistant. You end up with, and how we've seen this play out now in we've had the opportunity of time, I guess, where people have been using this. This has literally gone from people that were culling 10, 15, 20% of ewes with feet problems to that going down to 1 or 2%, and people that were very regularly foot bathing animals basically not filling that foot bath up for the year. And so as we've gone, the people that are really focused on this trait, the impact of foot rot on their business has gone from like their number one thing to a thing that sort of is no longer a problem. And we've seen that in our breeding flocks. When I first moved over there to New Zealand, and I took some great genetics from Australia with me, imported lots of semen to try and fix other things that were wrong with the sheep in terms of carcass and worm resistance. But the problem was that those sheep were susceptible to foot rot, and so I was as close to tears as I've ever been in the sheep classing race, culling a lot of amazing looking sheep that had all the attributes that we wanted, but couldn't walk for foot rot. So anyway, so yeah, I guess we were culling up to probably half, if not more than that, of our ram breeding flock of our young rams, based on foot rot when you expose them to foot rot. That now has changed a lot. We're down to whatever it is, 10, 15, 20%, and gets less every year. So we're having a major impact on how much foot rot is impacting farm businesses and breeding programs. So it's in that nice little exponential part of the curve, I think, where all the hard work's done, the slow bit's done, and now we're moving into quite a cool spot where we should make great genetic gain. Yeah, and it is definitely impacting the sheep and those businesses in the places that are using it. Some of you might have heard of the Lincoln foot rot gene marker test. That is an attempt at a silver bullet. One of the things that we want to understand is how useful that test is. As part of this work, it wasn't anywhere near the priority of the work, but it was something that at the time a lot of people were using that in New Zealand as a way to select foot rot resistant sires. So how that Lincoln test works is there's a haplotype or a group of DNA that gets scored on a 1 to 5 scale, and the good ones are meant 1-1. So they've got on both sides of the DNA, both strands of the DNA, they've got favourable haplotypes for foot rot resistance. So that's on the x-axis here, and on the y-axis or the vertical axis is our breeding value for foot rot. So if they're good for the breeding value, that means that we're resistant sire. And these are all the sires that we tested a while back now, because not many people do the Lincoln test anymore, so we don't really refresh this data. But so that's the first score one. So all those sheep, so the 1-1s through to 1-4s, there's no real correlation between the test and actual foot rot resistance. These are the first scores 2, so the 2 2s, the 2 3s, the 2 4s, again, no correlation. We had in the 3s, and so I guess all of that tells us is that that test is a very unreliable way of selecting for footrot, because it's not correlated with the actual breeding value of the animal after you score the progeny and work out which ones are the most susceptible. So and now there's a little blue dot there on his own. He's at 2 4, and he's at that time was the most resistant animal we had, and yet he tested one of the worst scores on that test. So yeah, a pretty unreliable way to select for footrot if that's been if that's been part of, and I know it's been used around the world a bit, but yeah, I'd encourage anyone to actually start scoring feet and actually scoring feet and making selection decisions based on the footrot and scoring those progeny and averaging the size and starting to learn what's going on, rather than relying on a single test, because there's so much more power in quantitative genetics than the single test. This test was always, I think, described to have about 2 or 3% of the genetic variation in footrot, and so it was never going to be much better than that graph. But I think farmers are a little bit prone to loving silver bullets, wanting to have a single test because it's easy. Take a drop of blood, send it in, and tell me the answer. Unfortunately, life isn't like that, and breeding's definitely like that, not like that. We need to do the hard yards if we want to make change in sheep genetics. So we're going to shift gears now. That's sort of footrot, and I was keen to leave plenty of time for questions. So yeah, rattled through that, but happy to go back and answer any questions. I think to summarize footrot, yeah, it is the I can't overemphasize how amazing it has been for the outcome now that we've sort of done the work. And as soon as you stop selecting those positives, those animals that are more susceptible in the flock, everything gets better. And I guess we've seen sheep now that there's still sheep around that are plus 0.5 and stuff, and they'll just get. I'm sitting on a fairly dry area of Australia, and I feel like saying that even get footrot here, like they are very susceptible to the disease, and when they get the disease, it gets severe. So they don't. It's not. Whereas the resistant ones might get the disease or a touch of it, but then they self-cure, and as soon as the weather might change a bit, they're the ones that self-cure and get going, whereas the other ones just limp for forever. So is the main cause of flystrike in Scotland, as far as my reading can tell me, and you're lucky enough not to have Licilia caprina. I think it probably thinks it's too rough and cold over there. But that's the one that absolutely eats us in Australia and New Zealand is caprina. But you've got sericata, who can obviously does a fair bit of damage as well. But it's a big cause of grief in your sheep, as far as my reading tells me, or in terms of flystrike, that's where the problem's coming from. They look pretty similar to me. I'm no fly expert. And I guess when we get onto flies, we are here seeing, and I'm not sure what the case is in Scotland, but we are seeing significant resistance to chemicals. Our old treatments for flies, or our preventative treatments for flies, are no longer working as effective as they were. And unlike worms, where refugia is where you can sort of bring back chemicals, or you can protect chemicals by having untreated animals, you can't not treat an animal for flystrike because it dies. So yeah, well, there's a real, I think, massive need for lots of work in flystrike resistance in this country, and probably yours. You've been through this in previous webinars, but obviously genetics isn't the only answer to any of these things. There's a whole range of things that we use in an integrated fly plan. But what we do know is that, again, as I said at the start, everything is heritable. And so all the bits that there's lots of indicators for flystrike that Johan Grief and his team, John Carlson, Tony Schlink, there's a team out of Western Australia, and Jan Smith in New South Wales, and all their colleagues. There's been a lot of work done on this. None of it's mine. Although we do a lot of the scoring and stuff now to try and select sheep that are resistant to flystrike. Probably the big ones on here. Breech wrinkle's not relevant to you unless there's the odd merino breeder around, but yeah, breech wrinkle is one of the big indicators in merinos, but that's not the case in other breeds. But in terms of all the bits that are related to Flystrike, we've got dag, we've got wrinkle, we've got urine stain, we've got breech cover, which is the amount of wool around the back end, and then the color of wool, and they're all moderately to highly heritable. So there's all of the component traits for Flystrike are all pretty heritable, which is again pretty good news. That's for breech strike. And if we look, so these are the scores of, if we go through and score animals on all those scoring charts, which I'll show a few of them. 1 is best and 5 is the worst. And you can see there if an animal scores, so if we look at just the yellow bars for now, dag, which is relevant to all sheep anywhere for breech strike. I assume the accumulation of feces is called dag in Scotland, like it is in this part of the world. But a score 5 is if you've got a sheep with score 5, that's one that's caked on all over it. That's 80% likelihood of getting fly struck in the right conditions in Australia, or almost any conditions in Australia, down to a score 1 where there's no dag and therefore no fly strike. So dag, a big indicator. Breech wrinkle's not relevant to you guys. Breech cover, so the plainer they are, or the bigger the area, the bigger the bare area around the anus and vulva, the less fly strike. And so again, 50% of, if animals have high breech cover, so that's wool right to the edge of the anus and vulva, it's sort of half of those sheep are likely to get fly strike. So big ability to shift. And all of those things are heritable, remember. So we can shift these animals to a place from lots of wool around the back end, lots of dag on it, and lots of urine stain, and then getting struck, versus we can select against all those things and end up with a much less susceptible animal. So that's the dag scoring chart that we use, or that's the AWI one. We use the same one. And so I don't think you would believe me if I told you that you can breed animals that basically don't crap almost. But it is true. So they'll hold pebbles even under lush green conditions, or worm outbreaks or whatever. So we've got animals now so we have a dag breeding value in Australia and New Zealand, and when we select animals for that low dag, they just do not get daggy. Their progeny don't get daggy at all. They will stay like that score 1 image there. In a mob, we'll have heaps of score 4s and 5s in size. And so I think you genuinely have to see this to believe it. Probably the same as the Footrot resistance, but this is even more stark because you walk behind the mob, or you bring those sheep in and you score them, and you just get a sire group that is just impeccable, just clean. It's very, very clean in a mob that's under a pretty big dag pressure. So yeah, again, I get pretty excited about this stuff. Never thought you'd get excited about how much crap's on the back end of a sheep, but it is just so powerful in terms of what we can do. And I guess as an industry, we've spent decades and decades and decades crutching animals, removing that dag, putting chemical on, whatever, and just accepted that's how sheep management needs to be. And it takes a while to think, well, hang on, we've got animals in here that aren't that way, so let's select for them. One word of caution: if you are about to embark on a breeding for low dags and breeding some tups with low dags, you do have to select for worm resistance at the same time. They're not the same trait. So what the natural farmer tendency is, if I select for low dags, because that'll be the ones that haven't got wormy. On a mob level, dags and worms are correlated. That is, if there's a worm challenge, then you'll have more daggy animals in the mob. But on an individual animal, there's very, very little correlation, and in some cases an unfavorable correlation between dag and worms. That is, the animals that are more daggy can be the ones that are actually resistant to worms, and that's not in every case, but we know that certainly it's not, that selecting for dag doesn't give you worm resistance, and selecting for worm resistance doesn't give you good dag. So they are independent traits, or have to be treated like independent traits, and both need to be part of your program. Again, just scoring. So neck wrinkle is not relevant, but the urine stain one is. And so again, at some animals, through whatever genetic reason, some animals are end up with a lot more urine stain than others, and that is heritable. And again, that's in some conditions that's the cause of Flystrike when there's not dag around. Just an indication of those breech cover scores. So we've got animals that are very closely walled, and then others that have a big natural bare area, and it obviously makes sense that you can't get fecal accumulation where you haven't got any wool growing. And so that's what we're doing now. Even in our merinos, we're going for those very bare breeches, and because you can grow plenty of wool in other spots, you don't need to grow it there. And we get pretty excited about animals that are naturally bare, because it obviously helps with that lack of dag accumulation. Well, lack of dag and worms, and lack of dag and urine, and the whole thing. Wool color is another one, and this will come back up when we talk about breech strike. But even in body strike, but even in breech strike, the color of the wool is related. So the pure white, clean wool has less fly attracting chemicals in it, and so is less likely for, and when you get, I mean, that staining is the result of bacterial activity on the skin, and you get bacterial activity on the skin, you get flies pretty happy with that to come in and feed on those bacteria, and then you initiate a fly strike event. So even in some of your sheep won't be relevant because they're different colors, but any white sheep selecting for whiter wool within in our environments anyway, that is related to reducing our susceptibility to fly strike. As a trait of its own, depending on which paper you read, the variability of breech strike, or the heritability of breech strike, is somewhere between 20 and 50%. So if you just select on those that get breech strike, you will make genetic gain. And I'm a bit of a fan of having periods of time where animals are closely monitored for fly strike, but not treated, not preventatively treated, and then those animals that get it becomes part of their selection, and it's got to be an intensive period. You can't leave them for days under that scenario. But even within your any tup breeding that's going on, if there is an animal that gets fly strike in our ram breeding flocks, that's an immediate cull. There's no second chances. We hear stories like, "Oh, it wasn't their fault. I should have crutched them earlier," or whatever. It's a great opportunity to get rid of that animal. If it's got fly strike, it's got genes that are susceptible to fly strike, and you don't want them passing on. So we're pretty hot on that. Literally anything I see that's got fly strike, or indications that it was previously had flies, then they're gone. I think there's an opportunity there for ram breeders to similar to how we have in Footrot, actually have a period of time where we challenge animals under a defined period, and then and find those that are more susceptible, and then average them out for the size and work out which of those size we want to breed on with. This is again Johan Grief's work, or the team over there. And so that's sire incidents of breech strike when they did that, and under some work these were on merinos in Western Australia. So where they didn't treat them, and so you've got all those bars are the average incidence of breech strike for each year for different sire groups. And I think 2008 is a nice indication of a tough fly year, and obviously different years have different fly pressure. But you've got a sire group there where they're over 100%. That is, everything got struck plus some got struck twice. Down to a group of progeny from a different sire in the same environment, where I think 3 or 4% of those sheep got struck without any preventative treatment done at all. And so that's the opportunity for us, that there's animals already in our flocks that are resistant to fly strike, and then there's others there that flies just love them. They've gone on with lots of work, so they had a selection line over there, and they found that there was animals that they could train sniffer dogs of their susceptible line versus the resistant line. They could actually train sniffer dogs to find the sheep that were resistant to flies without actually having fly strike on them. So just knowing that they're from a line that don't get fly strike, the sniffer dogs could tell the difference. So that led them to other work, and they've now identified a couple of compounds which are which are the causative or are the ones that the sniffer dog was finding and that the fly finds. So they've done all this crazy stuff with fly. I don't know what you call a fly nose, whatever that it is. And found that you can that there are some sheep that release an odor that's makes them much more attractive to flies. So there's lots of work that will go on here. It's sort of only, I think, in its infancy. We're doing a heap of work on dag and breech cover, but as the indicators. But even when you get all those indicator traits right, like dag, breech cover, urine stain, that still only explains 50% of the genetic variation in Flystrike. So there's other stuff going on that we need to understand, and that's why I'd recommend that no zero tolerance policy on flies. So what we encourage people to do under our system, you won't have, I don't think you've got breeding bees for dag and stuff, but I strongly encourage you to think about how you would do that. So we encourage our breeders to have negative breeding bees for dag, so those that are less likely to get dag. Breech wrinkle, again, not relevant. Low urine stain, at the moment, that's about to become a breeding bee, but it's not yet. Breech cover breeding bees we have, so we select heavily on them. And then wool color, we also have a wool color breeding bee. And again, we select heavily on that. So we spend a lot of time scoring. In fact, that's what I did yesterday afternoon. Scored 550 tups for their wool color and incidence of fleece rot in the to help breed our low or sheep that are less susceptible to fly strike. So just quickly go through body strike, which is the same as well, it's all the same stuff, but really that's some nice, lovely white merino wool that you might not see in your part of the world. But yeah, I've covered most of this off. Body strike's all about like wool color and wrinkle and fleece rot. So fleece rot we have, which I'm sure you have as well, which is where you get bacterial contamination through prolonged wetting of the skin, and then you get that crusting and that band, and that's heaven for flies. And we can select sheep that will stay white and not get that fleece rot under the same conditions. Yesterday was a classic example. You have some sheep that have big banding of fleece rot, and others that are perfectly white and not impacted. And so we can select for those animals that are less likely to get flies. I say it's trade expression's not easy, and that means that in Australia sometimes it doesn't rain. I imagine that's not an issue in Scotland. There'll always be wet, or often you would find somewhere in the year where you can keep them wet and then put pressure on wool color and fleece rot. But again, if you're getting much body strike, and I don't know the proportion of animals here, it's much more. Breech strike is a much bigger issue, and it would be there. But body strike can be an issue under some conditions, particularly humid, which again might not be a feature, but wet, where it does warm up a bit, where it's wet. We can, when you get those conditions right, then we go in and we score all the animals, and we find animals that have sire groups that have low incidence of these things. All that data gets sent in, gets turned into a breeding value, and so when we're selecting our animals, we're selecting on breeding values, not on just what we see, because we know the phenotype, or what we can see and what we can measure, is heavily influenced by the environment and is heavily there to confuse us. Whereas if we get down to breeding value level, we know we're working with something that is at DNA level. And I think the last one that I'll talk about is dermatophillosis, which we call dermo, which is where it gets excessive and you get really big crusting, and then you get into proliferation of a particular bacteria. And again, yesterday, a great example. I think one sire group maybe had 5 or 6 animals that had dermo, and yet no other animals in that flock had dermo. So again, these things are under have a genetic origin. So if you see these things, then it's an opportunity to knock out those animals that get it. I guess what we find here, which is interesting, is that when we select for these traits, we also get more lambs. So low breech cover, low head cover ewes have more lambs under our scenario. So there's sort of not many trade-offs that we have to work with, and same as with Footrot and flies. Really, we don't have any major issues with trade-offs. We've only got all favourable, pretty favourable correlations. There's a few things we need to make sure we get right. But if you get all a Flystrike resistant sheep, then there's not many things you're taking or you're having to give away to get that, and it's just time and selection pressure. I guess in terms of flies, obviously how you'd use your shearing times and crutching times and preventative chemicals is important. But I think in all breeding, you don't want to be doing one thing with the tups and a different thing with the ewes. You want to be, if you're putting selection pressure on at home on the ewe flock, then you want to make sure that the rams you're buying are also getting that pressure. What we see a fair bit is where there's a difference in that. So people go and buy the same tups they've always bought, and then they go home and they cull all the ones that get Flystrike or Footrot, and then they go and buy another set of tups that are the same again, and then you're going nowhere. You're spinning around in circles. The opportunity is to work closely with your ram breeder, your tup breeder, to um to make sure their selection policies are the same as your selection policy. If you want to make gain in these areas, you need to be doing both the ewes and the rams ideally. And I guess as much as possible encourage the use of breeding bays. I know you don't have that available to you yet, but if you build it, they will come. We need as an international industry to be working on these areas, and there's heaps of knowledge that's been gained in Australia and New Zealand that you could easily apply to without having to go through all the pain. We know that we now know these things work based on what we've seen. That's it for me. Really keen to take some questions. Yeah, I guess our job here is to help farmers navigate change, and we love what we do. More than happy to take an email or a phone call from anyone to chat about their individual circumstance, or just chat sheep. That's what I do. Yeah, and Daniel's already given a plug for the podcast, but yeah, listen along. We do get a few, and love having a few listeners from your part of the world. How are we going for questions?
That was great. Thank you very much, Mark. Yeah, plenty of questions coming in. We'll just get going on them. Is wool color selection applicable to other breeds, e.g., not merinos? Would you put much focus on other breeds?
Yeah, so we don't have all of your breeds, obviously, but so in Romney, it is true. We've got a range of composites, Romney, whatever. Not a heap of crossover in breeds, but I'd say it's 100%. It should hold true. I don't know that. Well, we'll say 90%. I don't know that 100%. I haven't actually done the work, but yeah, here it's applicable across breeds.
Yep, grand. One trait you didn't mention on the kind of Flystrike resistance side of things is wool shedding. And we know there's certainly a bigger uptake over your way on them. What was the research show on that side of things?
Yeah, so I didn't cover shedding breeds, and we've got animals. I guess there's a range of what we work. We've got animals that will shed through that breech area, and then we've got animals that shed completely, obviously. And yeah, I think shedding is the same as, well, not quite the same, but similar to breech cover in the sense that if they shed that area out regularly, then they're less susceptible to flies. I have seen under like pretty severe dag conditions, like coccidia problems, where you've got a lot of dag on the skin, you might get a shedding sheep breech strike, but it's very difficult and very rare to get breech strike in a sheep that keeps shedding. So yeah, definitely that's one way to get rid of the fly problem is to get the wool gone all completely.
Perfect. You also mentioned quite a few traits which involved for the Flystrike resistance, kind of altering wool or removing wool off certain areas. Do you find a correlation to wool quality or wool quantity? Obviously merinos are very focused on that.
Yeah, there is a bit, but not very strong. So yeah, one of the things that I guess the old timers well, that's not fair. One of the things that people originally think when you go, "Oh, we're going to bear out the points," is that, "Oh, we'll lose all fleece weight." But the beauty of breeding values is you don't become don't become dictated to by those correlations. You can break those correlations really simply by selecting for fleece weight and low breech cover. And that's what we've done. So we've got sheep now that on the wool growing areas grow heaps of wool, and then on the non-wool growing areas grow none. And that's, again, having seen that sort of stuff makes me even more passionate about genetics, because you can kind of, yeah, we are like, they're very malleable animals as we've got. Um, and so, yeah, we can, that correlation does exist. If you just go for one, you'll lose wool weight. And wool quality, not so much. Wool quality is probably better. Like a lot of the traits we're talking about, like improving wool color, will tend to make the wool finer and better and whatever. So that's a favorable correlation. But for quantity, you definitely have to be a little bit careful. And um, if if fleece weight or wool weight's important to you, then you have to just make sure you measure both and find the animals. Use breeding values so you're not being dictated to by the environmental differences. Um, Measure both and then find the ones that have both.
Superb. It's exciting, isn't it? It's the power of data.
It is indeed.
And they are quite a different looking merino, aren't they? Kind of the modern type, would you say, to maybe the traditional?
Yeah, and yeah, I get accused of ruining stuff, ruining breed a bit. Um, they're very different. So yeah, I mean, I could put up some photos of, like, and you wouldn't even recognize them as a merino really. But their job is to produce a great quality wool for next to skin wear, obviously. And so what they look like externally should be dictated to by their welfare traits, as long as we get enough high quality wool on the wool growing areas. And that again comes down to measuring enough stuff, and that's why we're right into this, heavily into scoring things. Like everything we can score on a sheet, we will, as in apply a number to it, rather than, like, all of us can cull sheep and say that one's better than that one. But applying the numbers to the equation and getting that converted into a breeding value, rather than, I'm sounding like a broken record, but it's just insanely powerful when you put the power of data and the power of 100 years of statistical knowledge into play, how much you can shift things that you wouldn't think is possible.
Certainly is. Questions are coming in thick now. Will be slightly combined. Well, I'll just go for this one. Your graph on foot rot incidence versus EBV was very impactful. Without EBVs, how easily can we select for foot rot resistance within our flocks, and how would you go about it?
Yeah, really good question. Those breeding values are almost a one-to-one correlation with the sire average. So if it were me, I would score all of your progeny. So if you're in a nucleus flock, then all of the the ewes and the tups all get, what are ewes called? O's, aren't they? Anyway, all of the animals get scored on that 0 to 5 scale, under a bit of a challenge. And then you average out their feet, or average out all of those progeny feet for each sire. And that is pretty well correlated with the breeding value. There's not a lot of,
Okay.
under the right challenge conditions, there's not a lot of what we would call fixed effects. So single, twin, dam age, some of the things that we know would impact on something like a weaning weight. A lot of those aren't there. So you can kind of almost, yeah, you can relatively, within your flock, you can do a pretty good job by averaging the sires, and then just selecting those animals that, they're either, or selecting those sires that have progeny that don't get forward, or selecting those animals that have a low average score themselves. So you can imagine you've got one that's 0.012 or something across its 4 feet. That average is whatever that is. That average is 0.75. And then you've got another one might be three on every feet, so average is 3. And using that number is pretty impactful.
Superb. How long does it take to breed Flystrike and foot rot resistance into a flock? If I select a ewe with good feet, for example, can I expect the offspring to also have no feet problems?
Yes and no. There's a bit of, yeah. I mean, to answer that question effectively, I reckon it took us the first 3 or 4 years to really get our head, like, score enough animals to know what was happening. and then from then on, it was kind of game on. And I think so I think probably 3 generations, which is 10 years, then you would see a big impact. But we've seen an impact within a couple of years, really, by taking out those susceptible ones. So once it's in your mind that this is a genetic trait, not a good farmer versus bad farmer trait, which is what Footrot can be considered as. Like everyone goes, oh, I don't get Footrot because I'm a good farmer, but there's conditions where it's just even even good farmers that really struggle. Or you can put all the effort in and still Footrot can still beat you. So yeah, under those, yeah, I think 3 or 4 years by taking out those susceptible ones, you will start making gain that you would notice, and then after 10 years, you'd be in a position where you'd wonder why you were farming how you were before.
I mean, it sounds quick, to be fair. What would be
Yeah,
the
I think I mean
typical sort of size of a stud flock you'd be working with doing quite extensive scoring?
yeah, and that might be what limits it a bit on your part of the world. Would be sort of 400 or 500 ewes, so 10 size, 500 ewes. It's probably our average, maybe, or slightly, but down to 300 or yeah, we probably don't have many less than 250 or so, but we have got people breeding their own rams who do it with a couple hundred ewes, and just be careful with how they select. So I think, yeah, I mean, scale makes it quicker, but equally, if your fertility and your reproductive rate's pretty good and you've got good turnover, you can make gain. It's only slow if you probably can't get through your generations quickly. Like if you've got low reproductive rate, then your replacement rate slows down, and that probably slows you down more than anything.
Yeah, no, I think spot on. Slight change of trait here. How are you tackling worm resistance?
Good trait. Yeah, so we have a breeding value for worm resistance. Again, on a broken record with all the work's been done here. So we've got a breeding value, so that's we get the mobs up to, depending on which type of worm's present, but in the scale worms, which you wouldn't be too many barbers pole in Scotland. We get up the egg counts up to sort of 400 or 500 eggs per gram. So the flock average is that. Then every animal gets individually fecal sampled, and that gets sent away and measured for, counted for worm eggs. And then that number again goes away, gets turned into a breeding value, and we use that to select the animal. So again, we're looking for a negative breeding value. We use lots of rams that are minus sort of 70, which means they have 70% lower worm egg count than the average sheep would. So you imagine you got a mob at 500, they're sitting at 150 eggs per gram and don't need drenching, whereas if a mob at 500, you'd be looking to drench them. So big variation. So we're using the individual scores, and again, if you didn't have the breeding value, you can use those individual scores. It's nowhere near effective because there's lots of variation in that trait. So the breeding value is good because it takes into account brothers and sisters in the flock, because the individual variation of a count can be high depending on like how long they've been off feed and yeah, so there's just enough natural variation in that trait. So the more there's things you need to account for where the breeding value is more powerful than it would be in something like Footrot. But yeah, that works, and again, that's taking drenches out, and again, we're under the, I don't know whether you've got capsules still or ever had them, but capsules have been taken off the market here, and we've got resistant to chemicals flat out here. Like triples are failing big time. So we're only down to your couple of big drench groups now, or new drench groups, and they're under a bit of pressure. So worm resistance is a massive focus for lots of our farmers.
Yeah, we're seeing widespread resistance over here as well. In terms of worm resistance, have you also looked into antibodies? There's a bit of work over here, kind of slightly positive for the blood antibodies, but not so much for saliva. But
yeah, we haven't, and yeah, I mean, there's the Carla test in New Zealand, but it's more expensive than WEC. So yeah, everyone we work with does the individual egg counts. we haven't done any of the antibody work. There is, yeah, I'm interested in all that work. Again, yeah, we're certainly not. It's whatever works. And so if it's heritable, we want to work on it. At the moment, we don't have tools that we can effectively use, I suppose. And so we are just going on the probably what I guess is a relatively crude approach. Just let them get wormy and select those that don't get it. But we're using the breeding meter to take a bit of the crudity out of it.
Yeah, you're seeing it work. How have you found the repeatability of Flystrike scores, particularly Flystrike as a lamb and subsequently as a ewe or mature animal? And then what about the same sheep in a different area? Do fly resistant sheep in New Zealand also demonstrate or repeat in Australian conditions?
Yeah, good questions, and a little bit outside of my direct experience. So what Joanne has shown is that if I had to put on that graph I showed of those sire groups, the one of the ones that was really good one year, it was the progeny of that, or that was really good the next year. So we know that across years, which is kind of similar to being in different environments, because of the fly, like every year is a new environment almost for Flystrike. Like you can get summer rain here and you'll get lots of Flystrike, or a hot dry summer and get very little. So we've seen it very repeatable across years, which means it's probably very repeatable across environments. I haven't sort of taken, I don't think we're far enough into it to know that it would definitely repeat across environments. But basically, if you've got it's the same as any trait. If you express the trait so you get animals that are getting Flystrike, then that's highly likely to be repeatable across. If you get a different somewhere else, but you get the same level of incidence of Flystrike, then the size are likely to rank exactly the same. So yeah, I think, and we know that for dag, very repeatable. Like the one that's daggy as a weaner will be the one that's daggy as a yearling, and as a 2-year-old and as a 3-year-old. Those sire groups just stay the same. So, and that's been the number one cause for us is dag of Flystrike. So yeah, I'd say without direct experience, I think all the indicators say that would be highly repeatable.
Yep. Great stuff. What age do you score the offspring for Footrot? Is there a minimum age to express, resistance?
Yeah. So there's some work I think actually done in Scotland. Did this guy did a PhD, which showed it's slightly less heritable under 6 months. So we try and get them over 6 months of age. And then whenever Footrot turns up after that, we have done them. We've taken that down to about 4 months of age now. We just want to get it past. So any differences that might have occurred while they're still on mum, we want that to kind of be cleared up. So put through zinc or whatever, cleaned up after sort of weaning. And then so they sort of all got an even footing, because in our situation, we'd be lambing in different paddocks, and so their exposure on mum will be different. So we would want to bring them in, clean them up a bit, and then give them all an even start. So we're sort of 4 months minimum, but over 6 months. There's a bit of work again out of Scotland that said it's slightly more heritable the older they are, and that would probably make sense in the sense that the immune system takes a while to evolve or to get up to speed. And so that would mean that we're likely to the older they get, the more the immune system's at play, and therefore the ones with a better immune system are showing their superiority.
Perfect. We've got a question here. Tight skins or fleeces are generally regarded as a positive here. Weatherproof and perhaps a bit of a cosmetic look. Yep. Your fleece rot photos seem to indicate that they are more susceptible to fleece rot. Is that your observation? So you're trying to suggest that maybe your tighter skinned animals might have more fleece rot. Might we be better to select for something a bit more open to reduce the risk of fly strike?
Yeah, when I talk tighter skins, it was tighter, more wrinkly, which I don't think is what you'd be talking of, sort of a closed fleece with a.
Yeah.
So I think we're probably talking different tight skins. And so I think, yeah, it probably, I would say not an issue. I think your fleece type will be fine. I think it's where I'm talking about skin wrinkle being like a quite tight skin where moisture can accumulate between the wrinkles. For you, I don't think that. Yeah, we have seen faster drying in the more open fleeces, but if they've got, and I thought that was part of the solution, but we've now seen that not play out. Wool colours are sort of a trait of its own. You can select for white wool regardless of the sort of tip structure.
Okay, perfect. Are you happy to do 2 more questions, Mark? I'm cautious of time.
Yeah, no, all good. Yep.
Perfect. Thank you. Have you got any flocks to the stage where they don't need any Flystrike treatments? Stop or maybe preventions?
I think Yoan got a fair way down the track, and then that sort of project stopped. We've certainly got farms that don't do any preventative treatment, and
Okay.
we'll monitor closely. And unless it's a really severe year, I find so certainly not routine jetting on some farms. I don't think that's the case on. They're probably in marginal fly environments. Like if you've got a really high risk fly environment, I don't think we've got any flocks at the moment that would stop altogether. No, that's probably not true. There are some. You just have to be careful to make sure. In some environments, it's obviously a lot easier. You can be a hero and not have to put chemicals on, but it's just because you don't actually have that much fly pressure. And so I think, yeah, I think there definitely are farmers that have stopped using chemicals and it's working. Yeah, a range of breeding philosophies have got them to that level. Yeah, I guess it's like all these things. You don't want to go cold turkey and find out you're in all sorts of trouble. But if you've got, yeah, you select for a while, then you can stop. At the moment, we've still got over 80% of the sheep in Australia are mules. So there's only pockets of people that have actually made the shift towards this type that doesn't require any treatment or any prevention.
Perfect. No, I think it's exciting from our end to hear the progress that some farms have made over there in terms of the Flystrike, in terms of Footrot, in terms of reducing wormers. Last question, a practical one here. 50% of a mob scoring a 2 and above for Footrot. I guess that looks like a pretty bloody lame mob. Do you find breeders struggle to get to that level of challenge? I think we would, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So that's, yeah, not pretty for a sheep manager to watch. And so my reading of what happens in Scotland is I don't think you'd get to that level. But so what we're doing at the moment is doing some work to reduce that threshold. I guess when you're doing research flocks, you can you go to what definitely will work, and then we're sort of peeling that back to what should work. And we are seeing that even under lighter challenges, the ones that are susceptible will be the ones that go down quick and stuff. So I think it's going to work with less impact or less severe challenge and therefore less welfare impact on the individual animals. So yeah, I think you'll be fine. We probably went all out to make sure we get a difference, but I think we'll end up at a much lower level. But we're just doing that work at the moment actually to work out what that looks like. Or Sam Walkham's doing that work.
Yeah, great stuff. Well, that will wrap up now, I guess. So a huge thank you to everyone for joining us tonight and all the great questions, and of course to Mark. Thank you very much for joining us. I think it's been really insightful.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks all. Great to have a chat.
Yep. Have a good day. Night, everyone.
Cheers.
Cheers.